in 1940, when the war broke out in Europe. I do remember hearing the sirens going because they were expecting that. Actually, the Dutch knew that it was going to happen, that the Japanese would invade.
I'm talking to Liewe DeHaas, age 86, at his home in Weston, Connecticut. Liewe was born and raised in what was then the Dutch East Indies and is today the country of Indonesia. He was there when the Japanese military invaded in late 1941. Liewe remembers what brought his parents to this colonial outpost in the first place.
My dad graduated as a pharmacist and chemist in 1931 in Amsterdam from the university. And at that time, the firms in Indonesia were looking for people to sign up, let's say, for 10 or 15 or 20 years, and you made triple the salary you could make in Holland.
Liewe and his family were living in Semarang on the island of Java, where his dad worked for a large pharmaceutical company. I asked him if he remembered Pearl Harbor.
Yes, indeed. My dad came from work and his face was completely ashen. He says, "Oh my God," he says, "Pearl Harbor has been attacked. What now?" And he says, "Oh my God, I hope we can hold out on Java, because that's where the majority of the armed forces were." But you know what? They were equipped so poorly. They were fighting the Dutch and the Indonesian personnel that fought with the Dutch with World War I rifles.
After Pearl Harbor, the Japanese quickly overran British and Dutch colonies throughout Southeast Asia, and the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies were one of their primary targets. With the Japanese army expected to invade at any moment, Liewe's family decided to head for the hills.
And then we moved to Jakarta, Batavia. We spent there about a year and a half until the Japanese landed in Sumatra, the island that lies here next to Malaysia. And then my dad died. Well, if we go to Bandung, which is in the mountains, it looks like a European town. It used to be called the Paris of the Far East. Beautiful mansions and everything, the boulevards and everything. And we moved up there, but then of course, unfortunately, they invaded Java.
While the local colonial army was poorly equipped, Liewe thought that the Dutch Air Force stood a chance, but they too were hamstrung by outdated equipment.
Now, the Dutch Air Force was pretty up to date. They had 30 flying boats, the big Dorniers, 4-engine jobs, and they had used those to fly from island to island, to see how things were and all that, and also for mail service and all that. And we had the so-called Brewster fighter planes. Those were old lumbering prop planes that were built in Buffalo, New York here. That's why they call them Buffaloes. The Dutch Colonial Air Force wanted B-25s, and they ordered 25 of them. And the United States said, well, Europe is more important right now than the war in the Pacific.
With little opposition from the air, Japanese airplanes were soon seen over the skies of Bandung.
We were in Bandung at that time, the last few weeks before we surrendered, and we were staying in a hotel because all furniture had been moved to Bandung in storage. And we were in one of those dugout, shelters, bomb shelters. But it was an opening at the end, of course, where you enter. And I remember my brother and I, we were rascals, really. We would go to the exit there, and my mom screaming, come here, because the planes were flying, over Bandung and dropping bombs. And I do remember seeing the little copper-colored bombs coming down. A couple of times they bombed, until I think 1 or 2 days before we surrendered. And my brother and I, we used to get on our bike and bike into downtown Bandung, and we saw then the craters there near a bank building and stuff like that. And my mother, of course, was going crazy, but we didn't. We just took off. And one plane got shot down, and the tail was sticking out of a villa. And I picked up a little piece of fuel pipe or fuel line or so, and I had it as a trophy.
According to the naval historian Samuel L. Morrison, the Dutch considered Java and Sumatra their, quote, second homeland where they had been trading and living for over 3 centuries. But after the Battle of the Java Sea, these islands too fell, and the Japanese soon arrived in Bandung.
And so we were in a hotel, and then my dad decided to more or less look shelter somewhere and hide away, because the rumor went around the men have to be picked up, all the civilians too, except the ones that were civil servants. The Japanese needed those for the time being to run the electrics and the water supply and whatever. So my dad left a revolver, shooting on top of a cabinet, like we have sitting here, one of those European tall cabinets. One day, the door bangs open, and here's this Japanese, after we surrendered, this Japanese officer comes in, there's 2 other Japanese, and they start searching the whole house. My mother almost died, because if they would have found the gun there.
Liewe's father was eventually picked up by the Japanese military, and he became one of 80,000 Allied civilians and POWs who lived in appalling POW camps or were sent to work on treacherous construction projects like the Burma Railway, the Death Railway as it came to be called, as it also took the lives of thousands of forced laborers throughout Southeast Asia.
So my dad got picked up eventually, and we were able to visit him one time on a military base outside Bandung. And I remember sitting in the train with my mom and my brother going to that place, Cimahi was called. And we passed by the airport, airfields there, and there were piles of little miniature private planes that were all bulldozed together so the Japanese wouldn't get them. All destroyed. And I said to my brother, oh my God, look at this, all those beautiful planes, they're all shot. They were all destroyed. So we came to the camp, and we were able to give him a little parcel, but then we were chased away by the Japanese, because he was standing behind the barbed wire, just like you see in this movie here. And that's the last time we saw him.
Liewe would not see his father for 3.5 years. Meanwhile, he, his older brother, and his mother were put into a Japanese detention camp in Bandung.
So in the meantime, we went into our first camp in Bandung. We stayed there for about 1.5 years. I developed, I wouldn't eat anymore, so they put me in a hospital there. And then I got malaria on top of that. And my mother was able to smuggle some quinine tablets from the local Indonesians through the fence, bamboo fence, that saved my life, really,
Liewe had started school in Semarang, but now his education, along with anything else resembling a normal childhood, would have to be put on hold.
And she was the head of the house, and those women were all, of course, going nuts there, because we had a South American woman there with her daughter, and we had an English woman there, and a couple of houses down the street were 3 American girls, UFO, that had been caught. It was too late for them to evade to Australia. And they were doing some shows, tap dancing, and they were playing the boogie woogie, the in the mood and all that. That was allowed the first few weeks in the camp. And then the Japanese, of course, took the piano and took it away. No radio, no record player, nothing. We were not allowed anything. Books were taken away, everything. And we had to speak Indonesian. They did not they did not accept anything in Dutch.
There is a 1997 Australian war film starring Glenn Close called Paradise Road. It tells the story of a group of English, American, Dutch, and Australian women raising their families in one of these Japanese detention camps. Liewe has seen the film and says it is pretty accurate.
Every morning we had to report to the main square, where it used to be a military camp there at that part of the camp, and stand in line there, and then this Japanese guy would stand on a wooden case and hold speeches in Japanese, and there was a woman there who translated it into Indonesian, not in Dutch. And then we had to bend down all the time and go up and bend down and all that. And if you didn't do it correctly, they would come and slap you in the face or whatever, or kick you and everything. So sometimes women would collapse, from the heat. Let's say they had caught a couple of women that were smuggling through the fence, through the bamboo fence. We had to stand there for a couple of hours in the heat, in the middle of the day, 95 degrees.
Eventually, teenage boys, like Liewe's older brother, were separated from their families and sent to a different camp. Not yet a teenager, Liewe was nearly pulled away.
They almost grabbed me because I was fairly tall for my age. And after 1 year, when they decided to move us to the next town, which is called Bogor, it used to be Buitenzorg, which means it's a beautiful town in the mountains too. And we were put in a camp there. But before we left, we were standing in line, and the Japanese came and they said, all boys 13 and older stay in the camp. And that was my brother. He was 13 at that time, or 14, whatever. And then they came to me, and they said, out of the line. And my mother started screaming, of course.
Until a brave woman intervened on his behalf.
Okay, we had a comedian there in the camp. A woman who was a cabaret sort of comedian, and she spoke Indonesian and a little bit of Japanese. I don't know how she did. She was Jewish, and she came to my mom. She says, "What's the matter?" "Well, he wants to take my Leo away." And so she turned around and she started screaming, and he got so impressed that he let me stay.
I asked Liewe if anyone ever tried to escape from the camp.
If you tried to escape, you were beaten up for days, yeah, and locked up and all that. They did terrible things. Women that tried to smuggle through the fence, they were beaten up and they were burning cigarettes on their breasts, and they did all kinds of things.
Liewe and his mother were later moved to a new detention camp, also in the mountains. But even the short journey could be treacherous.
So we stayed then 3 or 4 months in this small camp in Bogor, which is between Bandung and Jakarta. And then he took the train again, and it was horrible, that train. 2 women died in the car where we were. Because they were sick, no AC, windows closed. And there was a sentry on that one end of the car and one on the other end. And they were putting the train all the time on side spurs because another train would pass by. So it took a day and a half from Bandung to Jakarta, which normally takes an hour and a half.
Eventually, they were transferred to a camp in Jakarta, what was then the Dutch colonial capital of Batavia.
So when we arrived in Jakarta, we got into the worst camp that you may have seen the pictures of, so I don't know whether the pictures were there in it or not. It is called Chideng. T-J-I-D-E-N-G, Chideng. And that was the worst camp in Indonesia. The camp commander there had a sort of, how do you call that? He was going crazy when it was full moon. He got sick, moonsick. Besides that, at the entrance of the camp, where the sentries were, you would have seen those pictures, I'm sure, and they're there. He had 2 big monkeys, the one that you see in the mountains in Indonesia and in Gibraltar. I don't know whether you were there, but the British keeps them up there on the rock. Did you know that? They do that for good luck. They say, as long as the monkeys are here, we still own Gibraltar. Anyway, and he let those monkeys loose, and they were, of course, antagonizing us, and stealing food for us.
While in the camp in Jakarta, Liewe was put to work.
I started knitting socks for the Japanese army. They said, if you knit socks, they said to the women, you get a block of unrefined sugar, about, I would say, 2 inches by 2 inches by 2 inches a cube. Full with straw and all that, junk.
By the spring of 1945, as the Japanese military was losing ground on all fronts, life in the detention camps worsened considerably.
We were going day to day, and the last 6 months was really the worst. Yeah. That's when the food was hardly any food. As a matter of fact, they caught 3 women smuggling, and for 3 days we didn't have any food. 3 days to let this, just, that's it, you know. They kept all the food out the camp, all the rotten meat and intestines and all the junk that they gave us, you know, so. But somehow we survived.
Some 30,000 European civilians would ultimately perish in the Japanese detention camps throughout Asia. Liewe and his family were some of the lucky ones. And shortly after they were liberated by British troops, they learned that their father had survived the war as well.
He got 1 year he was in Java, slave labor. Then on 3 transports they left Jakarta, Batavia to Saigon. 2 got torpedoed by the Australian or American Navy. Yeah, because they knew that was all railroad equipment that they were using for there, you know. They knew that the middle ship contained all the POWs, so they spared that. And my dad was on that, so he arrived in Saigon, and after the war he hitchhiked with a bomber B-24, I guess, to Bangkok.
Transportation was not easy in post-war Asia, but one day Liewe and his family were able to find passage to Bangkok.
So one day a British officer came through the streets, and he said, listen, there is a truck. Anybody who wants to go to Bangkok, get a suitcase and get on board this truck and we'll take you to the harbor. And that's how he got on that ship. It was a Liberty ship that was built here in New York, I guess. And no AC, of course, and we were sitting in the hall down there, 120 degrees. It was terrible. No beds. We were all in those hanging things. What do you call it? Hammocks, yeah.
While the crossing to Bangkok was stifling and difficult, the last leg of the trip was nearly catastrophic.
When we arrived in the Bay of Bangkok, or whatever you call it there, we were transferred onto one of those landing craft. You know, there was the flat bottom. And it was run by Americans at that time. Yeah, it was an American Navy. And they took us upriver to the Bangkok, because Bangkok is about 10 miles inland. And we going up the river, and there are wrecks everywhere, left and right, bombed out ships, you know, half sunk and all that stuff. And suddenly we hear a loud bouncing underneath the boat. Boom, boom, boom. And then right behind the landing craft, thank God, a huge explosion. It was a mine. And it was a time delay mine. And you know, the river there is about 2 miles wide, full of crocodiles, so you don't want to get in the water there, you know. So the crew, I remember the machine, they came out of the machine room. Why the shit? She said, bloody hell, I have a mine here in the river. We were so lucky.
Finally, they arrived in Bangkok and saw the husband and father that they had not seen in 3.5 years.
He was in Bangkok as a pharmacist in a military camp there for the British. And one day he found out that there was a ship coming from Jakarta, and my mom was on there, my brother and I. And we arrived in Bangkok, and he picked us up from the harbor there. And I remember going to the stadium there, and it was full with cars, old cars, all from the 30s and 20s even. And they were all Japanese working on these cars, trying to fix them up so that the British military could use them as transport, you know. So my dad, he just walked in. He had a captain. He was captain at that time, status, you know, his rank. He walked in and he said to the sentry, "Which cars are ready?" Oh, he says, "There's one there. There's a German car there, and from 1938." Oh, I said, "My dad said, okay, let me have a look at it." He walked to it, turned the key, and he drove right out without checking out with the military.
Post-war Thailand was still pretty bleak and flooded with refugees on the move. Liewe's dad had to intervene to prevent the family from being separated once again.
We arrived in Bangkok, and my dad smuggled us into this military camp because the rumor went around that the Red Cross wanted to transport us inland about 100 miles north of Bangkok in the jungle in an old POW camp for the time being. And my dad said, not on my dead body. So he took us out in the middle of the night. He rented a bus, an old bus, with Thai people in it, and took us to the camp. It would have been the end of us, really.
After the war, Liewe's parents had no plans to ever return to the Dutch East Indies. After all, there was nothing left for them to go back to.
He was so bitter about the whole thing because we lost everything. He had a brand new Ford, 1941 Ford, two-door coupe, you know. Bank account, furniture. We had a refrigerator. We had a very modern house, you know, with all the amenities, a screen in the window, so you couldn't get everything. Everything was stolen.
Eventually, the family booked passage to return home to Holland, leaving with little more than the clothing on their backs.
We didn't have. We stopped. Not in Suez, but on the other side of the canal. I forgot the name of that. There's a British camp there. And they took us with a little train inland, about 15 miles. And they had tables there with clothing. And it was all used clothing that came from England and from the United States, mainly, I think. And we were able to choose a pair of shoes, pants and garment, you know, all used garment. We had nothing, absolutely nothing, you know. So.
Like many World War II survivors, Liewe's dad spoke little of his experience as a POW. But over the years, stories would spill out, some that left lasting and painful impressions.
My dad got beheaded almost himself because he was the last person who knew about medical things, because the doctor, the Australian doctor that was there, died. And so he started doing operations, and he grew herbs. He learned that from the Chinese before World War II, and what was healing and all that, and he used that. He made alcohol and everything out of rice and whatever. And eventually the Japanese came to him and they said, if you don't help us out, because they were getting sick too, and no more supplies the last 6 months. They didn't, no more drops, you know, from Japanese Air Force. They were dying themselves. So then one day, an Australian plane came over, a DC-3, and dropped off parachutes outside the camp. So my dad went to the commander and he said, I want those medicine. Well, no, it stays out the camp. You can take a few things. So my dad, somebody sewed all kinds of pockets in his pants and everything. He went out to camp and he stuffed himself completely with all kinds of medicine, penicillin and all that, you know, it was already available then. And he came to the sentry, and the sentry searched him, and he called the camp commander. And the camp commander said, well, you take too much medicine, you're going to lose your life. My dad said, why? Well, you didn't listen to us, so. But they couldn't do it, of course, because they needed him for themselves, you know. So they let him dig a grave. He had to kneel down, blindfolded. And then what they do is they chop off your head, boom, and they throw the body, they push the body into this grave. Well, they took a wet rag, and he didn't see that because he was blindfolded, and they slapped it on his neck. Can you imagine when you expect to be beheaded and you get this wet rag around your neck, which feels almost like a sword? He survived, but mentally he was never recovered completely. One day we were in Amsterdam in '71, and he wanted to buy some souvenirs for my daughters, for my kids. And we went into the souvenir shop, and lo and behold, 5 Japanese walk in, the same age as my dad. So obviously they were from World War II. And my dad turned around, he said in English to them, well, I had a very nice time with you guys in the Pacific. I said, Dad, please, let's go. So I took him by the hand and I said, listen, Dad, let's go out of here. And we got out of the store. I said, I didn't want any scene there, you know, whatever.
"5 years ago, Liewe and his wife Lieke returned to Indonesia for the first time since Liewe was a child. With some help from some old maps, they found the home that he had stayed in Jakarta.
There was an Indonesian woman with about 10 kids living in a garage next to the house, but the house itself was empty. At first she wouldn't let us in the house. And she says, no, you cannot go in the house. I said to her, please, I was here as a kid, I would like to go inside. So we climbed, the doors were locked, so I climbed through a window into the house. And I sat in the same room where the monkey took my banana.